This question is open to both of you. Methodological naturalism is not methodological anti-supernaturalism. Intelligent design theory's methodological theism in natural science seems to appeal as apologetics. Yet religious scientists have responded cautiously. Claims of theistic science can easily become idolatrous, turning into theocratic science. How do we protect science from intrusions of theological views?
You can't. What you think about reality will color how you do your science. Now, we should allow evidence to lead us where it wants to go, but we don't come to evidence as blank slates. And I would also emphasize, we don't demarcate science from non-science very easily.
And I'd just like to point out that in the history of science, a number of times people have proposed ideas that were viewed very suspiciously and tried to be rejected, but turned out to be later accepted. For example, Isaac Newton, when he proposed gravity as a force, I'm told that many people of the age thought that that was like a cult. It was non-scientific because people thought then that force could only be exerted when two bodies hit each other, and yet he was proposing some action at a distance. And another example is the Big Bang theory. Many scientists, physicists explicitly argued, they said that it can't be scientific because science requires an eternal universe. And any explanation that says that the universe began in time is, by that fact, non-scientific. And in intelligent design, I see those objections the same way, that they're just saying that it can't be true because, by definition, science can't do that, and I don't consider it a strong objection.
I think the bottom line as Christians is we should care about what's true. If it is true, life is designed, that's the framework we should use. If it's true that life came about through a gradual evolutionary process, that's the framework we should use. The bottom line is life is advanced technology. Talking about the origin of life as if it's the same thing as the origin of a crystal is fundamentally false. When you look at life, it is advanced nanotechnology with information processing, energy production. It is a miniature spaceship. And what you have to realize is there is a dichotomy between natural processes like the sun moving in our galaxy or the earth going around the sun, things like crystal formation, whatever. That is completely different categorically than what life is. You cannot understand life through purely natural processes any more than you can understand a car by the chemistry of plastic, glass, and metal. What happens is when you look at who is advancing biology, it is the people that have been most effective at breaking free from the evolutionary framework and applying engineering. There's a field called systems biology, and what's happened is they apply engineering principles of control systems, feedback loops, top-down design. They have essentially abandoned, not intellectually, but practically, evolutionary assumptions in place of design language, tools, and assumptions. At the end of the day, they'll say, oh, and it evolved that way. But it's more of just a concession. There's no logical connection. So again, who is advancing science? It's those who look at life from a design perspective.
One thing that science does is look for natural causes. What I find interesting is in the case of cosmology, our best science says that explanation in terms of natural causes is incomplete. So science points, if we see it as the search for natural causes, to its own incompleteness. I see no reason why in investigating the origin and development of life that we might not get the same result. That our best science points to the fact that we don't have complete explanations in terms of natural causes.
This is addressed to Dr. Behe. The similarities of banding patterns of human chromosomes and primate chromosomes are often used as a proof of evolution. How would you address this?
Well, if you remember one of the first slides that I used in my talk last night, I said Darwin's theory has multiple components. Some are interesting, but ultimately trivial. Some are important. And the important thing is design, whether random processes or intelligent processes are necessary. At best, an argument such as is implied here that there are similarities between apes and humans points to common descent. And again, I think that's interesting but trivial. And it doesn't explain where apes would have come from. It doesn't explain how the fantastic transformation into human beings could have happened. It just says, well, they have this and they have that, and maybe we had a common ancestor. That being said, you can also say to yourself, well, gee whiz, we can easily see that humans and apes have much different biology and have much different capabilities. So if we see that these banding patterns are very, very similar, then they don't tell us much about biology. That we have to look for something else to tell us about biology. Again, if we say that, well, ape DNA sequences or protein sequences are 98% the same as humans, well, some of us might be 98% similar to apes, but I was looking over there. But it's clear to a child that apes and people are very different organisms, and so that might mean that that's simply a bad measure of whether apes and humans share a common ancestor. So that fact is either misleading or trivial, I think. And in any case, it doesn't tell us how design was affected in life.
And again, I could go either way on common ancestry, just to be perfectly frank. There's some good reasons to believe it. You see sort of a progression of, you have like reptiles, reptile-like mammals. However, even if common ancestry is true, what you're seeing is dramatic infusions of information in one generation. Because when you look at studies of the genetics of embryology, that's the way you create a body plan. The reason I've got 5 fingers and I've got a brain with a certain structure is because when the egg of a human starts to divide and turns into a fetus, into a human, that whole process is controlled by a very complex genetic network with a bunch of other stuff. All mutations which affect that, which are expressed, are harmful. Most are fatal. That's important to realize. Not one mutation has ever been observed in any organism that could help drive a major transformation. As Dr. Behe has mentioned, all of the mutations we see that can help evolutionarily are either damaging genes or there's trivial modifications. That's the science. So when you look at the genetics, when you look at observational evidence, it shows that evolution can only do very small changes. When you look at the fossil record, what you find is a consistent pattern of when anything radically new appears, it appears suddenly without series of transitions going back to an evolutionary tree. The Cambrian explosion is a classic example where the first representative of many of the major animal types appear suddenly within the resolution of the fossil record, and then that body plan stays fixed. If you look at the math, there's mathematical analysis by people like Dredd and Schmidt. What's Ola's last name? Ola's last name? Never mind. There's a paper by Gager, Beckley, and Ola that deals, remember the last name?
I forget.
That's fine. That deals with a mathematical analysis. You're rain on my parade. That deals with how fast can mutations appear and move through a generation, through a population. In the time period of the Cambrian explosion, an entire new phyla came into existence, is enough time for 2 neutral mutations, which are coordinated and specific, to appear and spread through the population. The mathematical constraints on evolution compared to what needs to happen is like the difference between what a pole vaulter can vault and the distance to the moon. So the science, if you're honest about it, shows you that there has to be massive infusions of information where within 1 generation there has to be a complete re-engineering of an organism. So maybe common ancestry is true, you could argue that, but it doesn't matter because you see essentially intervention, infusions of information in a geological instant. Now also, if you ask what's the main reason people believe in evolution, either it's extrapolations of trivial changes in ways that are unjustified, or it's similarities. But here's the problem. If you were to look at, imagine aliens came to Earth and looked at all the similarities in human artifacts. They would think, what incredible evidence for evolution. You've got this progression of like a unicycle to a bicycle to a motorcycle to a car. And isn't a motorcycle an incredible transitional fossil? I mean, it's halfway between a bicycle and a car, right? But the problem is you see lots of similarities that don't fit a pattern of common ancestry. Like you have a 2-way radio in both an airplane and a police car. Is that because of a common ancestor? No. Same thing in life. The similarities in life and the differences do not fit a consistent evolutionary tree. If you take all of life and fit it within a tree, about 2/3 of the data would not fit. You've got the genes which are in the wrong place, you've got commonalities that are in the wrong place, you've got similar species which will develop through completely different means. The pattern of similarities looks like an engineer using similar design modules for a given purpose. So again, a lot of the evidence for evolution is circular reasoning. Again, common ancestry isn't unreasonable, but the bulk of the evidence shows there's massive infusions of information, and the pattern of similarities looks like an engineer, not a random process.
We've heard a lot of different arguments throughout this conference for the case for intelligent design. But one person says, this leaves me with a one-sided perspective. What leads intelligent design scientists to believe the naturalist perspective? What evidence goes against the intelligent design theory that you guys have proposed? Can you steel men, in terms of the opposite of straw men, the best argument you can for the naturalist perspective?
Well, my colleagues are chickens. They may not be related, though. One thing I run up against in the classroom teaching philosophy is people want everything to balance out. They want one view to be equally balanced by another view. And sometimes it isn't that way. Sometimes, in fact, we hope, the evidence takes us one way rather than another. That doesn't mean there aren't difficulties. But I suppose if we were asking what would convince us of naturalism being true, is if you could really point to conditions that are not manipulated, so you haven't set them up, so you have to do this step then, and this step then, and this step then. If you could mirror natural conditions that would lead to a cell, then Occam's razor would say that you should take that explanation. The point is, that's not where the evidence leads. So if you're asking me what kind of evidence would persuade me, the kind of evidence I just mentioned, but it doesn't seem that we have any evidence like that. Anything we see in life is incredibly sophisticated and bears huge marks of agency that we know from our own experience is contrary to undirected natural causes.
The best argument against intelligent design, I know of none, I'm afraid. I know I'm unbiased and everything, but just like I don't know of any good arguments that Mount Rushmore was not designed. I mean, you see in the structure of the machinery of life, you see the design just as you see in the faces on Mount Rushmore. You see the purpose, you see the function, you see the parts fitted to each other. And as Professor Larmer said, there are no explanations. I tried to convey that in my second talk by looking at Richard Lenski's response to some of these arguments. And they say words, but there are no arguments. I mean, to an unbiased observer, I think. So I'm afraid that the prominence of Darwinian theory in the academy today is based exclusively on sociology rather than on science. That is peer pressure to believe the same thing.
I've been at this for 30 years, and I am, what is really, I'm the ugly American, so excuse me if I'm a little bit blunt, but it's been interesting to see how consistently the critics of Michael Behe, the critics of Doug Axe, have consistently either misrepresented their arguments or misrepresented the science, or used almost entirely circular reasoning, or arguments based on imagination. And that's the challenge, is that what happens is the debate of intelligent design versus evolution is kind of like you're on a movie set and you ask the question, what are the capacities of Harry Potter's magic wand? Now, if a person is talking about the real world, it's going to be stirring tea, using as a pointer. But if they're talking about the imaginary realm of Hogwarts, it has limitless power, right? In the same way, I go on forums where I debate evolutionists. I try to have a courteous conversation, but that's very difficult. And constantly they appeal to what's possible in the imagination. And the greatest challenge for me is to pull them from the realm of Hogwarts into the real world. Now, if you were to ask what are the most common arguments against ID, let me make it very simple for you. There's a book called Four Views on, what is it called? Four Views on Creation. And the person who wrote the critique of intelligent design is a very, very sincere Christian. I have the deepest respect for her. But she's incredibly deceived and incredibly naive on the science. And a lot of the arguments, let's go through them. Like one of the strongest arguments for design is the rarity of proteins. That if you look at the hard evidence of how hard it is to get a protein to fold, it's like 1 in 10 to the 77. And what happened is you look, what was her response? Oh, myelinase. All of the critics talk about myelinase. Myelinase is a protein that was believed to have evolved from a random sequence. It's all over the internet. Look up myelinase. So, hey, if this random sequence produced this protein that can degrade nylon, that shows how simple it is to get a protein. It's a powerful argument, but it's a complete myth. Myelinase did not come from a random sequence. It was based on 2 mutations of another pre-existing protein. It was science completely made up. If you go to the next argument in the book, it's this research study that basically took these random sequences and they tried to get some function out of it. So the function was basically if it folded properly, then there would be a reaction that wouldn't take place. When you look at the research, this thing would only fold like in a high acid. It wasn't a protein. So people are constantly appealing to research on these sequences of amino acids, which aren't actual proteins, to talk about the rarity of proteins. That is the definition of junk science. And then when Stephen Meyer, he gave this argument about how all mutations to these developmental networks are harmful, this author said, oh, but these evolutionists have imagined that in the past, the developmental networks are completely different. So think about this. Every single branch of the evolutionary tree, the genetics was completely different from today, and then once it went through all the evolution, suddenly all the genetics and all the branches in the same way transformed into the types that we see today that can't change. That's nonsense. So when you look at the arguments, almost all of them are misrepresentations of the science or of the design arguments. So it's really hard for me to think of an argument that just really isn't dumb. I'm sorry. But let me be blunt, if I haven't been so already. The Christian community is being conned. I mean, you have a lot of Christians, because what happens is the academy will say, we will accept you, we will give you positions of honor if you commit to bowing your knee before scientific materialism. So if you commit to suppressing the evidence of design that you see, if you commit to accepting the secular creation stories uncritically, you will gain prominence in the academy. And for those of you going to the sciences, that's a real question you'll have to ask. And many people will accept scientific materialism because they can't deal with the persecution. And I'm not even saying that's a bad choice. I'm not even saying that's not God ordained. I think a lot of it, like the army of Gideon, where what happened is God allowed those people who had fear in their heart to go home, and there was no shame in that. So I don't think these Christians that embrace scientific materialism are bad people. It may be God's will for them to be in the academy, who knows? But the bottom line, if you care about truth and you look at the evidence for design is it's really clear, it's really obvious. And it was interesting, I was at the Royal Society meeting, and these top-level evolutionary scientists have said, look, we now know that natural selection cannot create innovations. That the standard evolutionary model, what you see in your textbooks, can only create small changes. This is what the top theorists know, that the model that you hear isn't true. Small changes, not massive transformations. So the whole conference was about other possible mechanisms that could create innovation. Not one talk gave one shred of evidence that any mechanism could do anything beyond a trivial change, like the addition of digits, like the six-fingered man from Princess Bride. Sorry. And here's what you have to understand. When Darwin framed his theory, and what's interesting is what Darwin said publicly was very different from what was in his private notes. There's a really good book by Michael Flannery, is his name? Michael Flannery, thank you. He redeemed himself. That talks about Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace was one of the co-discoverers of natural selection, and he believed in intelligent design. He did not believe a blind, undirected process could explain life, but natural selection worked through an intelligent agent of some sort. Darwin said no, because Darwin was reading people like David Hume and the materialist, and he was a solid materialist. And what happened was his theory was designed specifically to suppress the evidence for design. He read William Paley and specifically designed his theory to counter Paley, saying, yes, you see indisputable evidence for design in nature, but we're going to say that this blind, undirected process can do all that creativity. It's based on pure mythology. So, sorry about that.
Okay. Very, very short comment is that during Professor Larmer's talk, he said he never heard anybody seriously use the argument from ignorance. But I hear it all the time. You haven't proved that the flagellum can't arise by Darwinian processes. Therefore, it has, and every other feature of life as well. So those are the sorts of arguments that we run into.
So we have, on account of time, just two final questions. So I'll ask.
Can I say one thing?
Very brief.
I'll try to be. I'm much briefer than these guys. When you ask for contrary evidence, just by analogy, how many of you believe the blood circulates in the body? Okay. What's your best evidence and argument against that? I bet you don't have one because it's so clear. If you're going to say, what's the best evidence against intelligent design, it may be that the evidence is just as clear as for the blood circulating in the body.
So two final questions. One is directed to Dr. Behe, the other one to Dr. Larmer. So Dr. Behe, as briefly as you can.
He was the one. He was the one.
You're guilty by association, I mean, at this point.
Hey.
Being an openly Christian high school student in a public school is not the easiest of tasks, especially when you are questioned by non-believers who attempt to shame you for your beliefs. Speak to those who are feeling empowered by what we've learned and are ready to speak about this topic with our non-Christian friends and colleagues. How should we go about engaging with our culture about the topic of intelligent design?
Okay, that's a very difficult question. All I can say is that be informed, read widely, know what other people think and their reasons for it, and know what you think and your reasons for it. and be gentle, be friendly, be nice, because, you know, they're sincere people, you know, and you might be the reason that they, you know, change their minds if they see that you're not an enemy, that you're a good person. And I'm a Catholic, and we have a saying, offer it up. And that is to endure your sufferings and offer them to God for His greater glory. It is a very difficult situation. Lots of people have been in it. So I'm afraid that's the best I can do.
And it's not bad to not cast your pearls before swine. Wait till people have a genuine interest. And I would add, it's not a bad idea to wait until you have tenure.
And thank you very much for your patience. And there's been an incredible amount of insights and thoughts and information that you guys have shared with us. For a closing question, someone has a question for you, Dr. Miller. Could you briefly share about your journey from denying the existence of an intelligent agent to the existence of God? In other words, how did you arrive to where you are now, from studying science to maybe there's a designer to God, to that God being found in Jesus Christ?
I would say, and this is the problem, when you talk about personal journeys, it's hard to parse out every external influence. So the intellectual journey was, the first book I read was Evolution, a Theory in Crisis by Michael Denton. And it was interesting because I met Michael Denton. He works with Discovery, and I'm like, Michael Denton, I can't believe I'm working with you. Sorry. And then I read Philip Johnson's book, Darwin on Trial. And then I read Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. So that was part of the intellectual journey. Like for me, the big issue was the reliability of Scripture and also science. So the science was not hard. I mean, there's so much evidence for design in Scripture. And again, a lot of it was honestly, it's God's providence. Like, I said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you exist, you have to show me the truth. And if you do, I will do whatever you want. That's the key. My life is yours. And that's the hard part. Because in apologetics, we're kind of like a dental hygienist. We're helping God, but God is doing the work. So for me, what happened is God just put me in contact with amazing people. Like Craig Keener was at Duke when I was there, and he's a world expert in the New Testament. So he helped me with my New Testament questions. The Shroud of Turin, I don't know if you studied that, but I met a world expert on it, so that's sort of an interesting side issue, which is a long talk in itself. But also there is that in encountering God supernaturally, seeing miracles, feeling the presence of God, sensing His love, the power of Scripture. So for me, it was a gradual journey. It was a hard journey, but it was partly intellectual. I read Eternity in Their Hearts, which talks about how God planted the seeds in different cultures. And part of it was experiential. Okay, here was a big difference. I think a hard part is so many Christians live as if God didn't exist. They live a schizophrenic life where they're Christian on Sunday and maybe Wednesday night, but then they live their life as if God wasn't even real. I met Christians who lived their life consistently with the gospel and laid there in their life, and God answered their prayers in incredible ways. They influenced nations. So both it was the science, it was my personal encounter, and seeing it really work in the Christian community.
Thank you very much for sharing what you did, what you have these last days. Let's give a warm applause, a loud applause to thank our panelists.